Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to History's Throne. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me on this journey back in time. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether it's morning, evening, or the quiet hours before dawn, I invite you to get comfortable. Let your body rest. Let your mind drift. Let my words paint pictures for you as we return to a different world. If you'd like, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you enjoy slow, immersive storytelling that brings the past to life, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss a journey like this one. But you don't have to do anything right now. Just listen. Just breathe. Let's begin. Royalty in the Middle Ages did not simply wake up and pull on a tunic. For kings, queens, and noble heirs, waking was a ceremony. Dressing the monarch was a ritual of hierarchy and symbolism. Every garment a declaration of power. Every gesture choreographed. In the courts of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the monarch did not dress themselves, and often could not. Dozens of attendants, sometimes more, were involved in the daily act of simply putting on clothes. It was not about ease, it was about order. In France, the ritual of the lever du roi, the king's rising, reached its most elaborate form under the later monarchy, but its roots were medieval. The king would lie in bed, beneath thick furs and embroidered linens, while courtiers gathered in the bedchamber. One servant handed him his shirt, another offered his breeches. A favored noble might be allowed to hold the royal stocking or lace the boots. It was an honor to dress the king's body, because that body was not viewed as ordinary. It was a vessel of divine rule. Even the king's hair could not be tended in solitude. A royal barber might arrive with oils, combs, scissors blessed with ritual. The monarch sat still while layers of identity were restored. Ring, robe, sword, scepter. Each item returned him, not just to wakefulness, but to kingship. A robe stitched with lions or fleur-de-lis wasn't merely decorative. It was a sign that the ruler stood not only as a man, but as the earthly representative of a kingdom, a people, and in some cases, of God's will itself. This choreography extended beyond clothing. Royal teeth might be cleaned with crushed herbs and linen by an attendant. A basin of warmed rose water might be brought for the king's hands. Even the act of breaking fast was layered with symbolism. Who entered the room, who served the bread, who was dismissed before the monarch took the first bite. All these things mattered deeply because power was not seen as personal. It was ritualized, layered, sacred. To break those patterns would be to unravel the very threads of rule. For queens, the rituals were no less exacting, though often more private. Ladies-in-waiting would comb out long hair, tie laces, choose veils. In some cases, the queen might be massaged with perfumed oils, wrapped in silks lined with ermine. Her fingers jeweled one by one. A mirror might be held, but she was never alone. Her reflection was never private. Even her face belonged, in a way, to the realm, and in her clothing, stitched with imported cloth, sewn with gold thread, she carried the expectations of diplomacy, fertility, and divine femininity. There's something almost unbearably strange to the modern ear in these customs. The idea that the simple act of rising from bed would involve so many hands, so much watching, and yet for medieval royalty, this was the natural rhythm of life. Privacy was not the goal. Ceremony was. Because the body of a king was not merely flesh, it was a symbol, a site of power, a theater in motion, and sleep, in this world, was the one interval when the costume was removed, when the ruler became, for a moment, only human. And in the morning, that humanity was veiled once more, piece by piece, sleeve by sleeve, until the monarch stood again in full regalia, a living emblem of kingdom and crown. The strangeness, perhaps, is not that they lived this way, but that we ever forgot they did. In the medieval imagination, power was not just political. It was physical. It coursed through the monarch's body, as surely as blood, and at times it was believed to possess miraculous force. Chief among these beliefs was the idea that the king could heal by touch alone, not with herbs, nor prayers, nor physicians, but with his bare hands. It was not a metaphor, it was a ceremony, and it was known as the royal touch. The ailment most famously associated with this rite was scrofula, sometimes called the king's evil, a type of tubercular swelling of the lymph nodes, often visible along the neck. In the modern mind, this is a disease of the body. But in the Middle Ages, it became something else, a visible mark of suffering that only royal grace could cure. And so across centuries and kingdoms, thousands gathered in silent hope, lining up to be touched by the king's hands. English and French monarchs both claimed this power, though the practice was particularly elaborate in France. The ritual often took place after Mass, during great feasts or public holy days. The afflicted would be brought forward, row by row. The king, solemn and robed, would lay his fingers gently upon the swellings. Sometimes he would make the sign of the cross. Often he would utter a simple phrase, "Le roi te touche, Dieu te guérit." The king touches you, God heals you. A coin or token was then pressed into the sufferer's hand, something to carry home, something to remember. Not everyone believed in the ritual's efficacy. Chroniclers recorded mixed results. Some swelling vanished, some did not, and yet the act itself held power, even when the cure did not come. It affirmed a truth deeper than medicine, that the king's body was different, that he was not merely chosen by God, but channeled God's will in the flesh. The king healed because he must, because the people needed it to be so. These were not fleeting superstitions. Henry VII of England reportedly touched thousands during his reign. His son Henry VIII continued the practice, despite his growing distance from traditional church rites. Even Charles II, centuries later, and long after the Reformation, revived the ceremony with theatrical flourish, once healing over 90 people in a single sitting. The power of the ritual endured, even as science began to cast shadows on its premise. In moments of suffering, the ancient instinct to reach for the miraculous never vanished. To the modern eye, it may seem strange, this quiet procession of the sick, each pressing forward not for medicine, but for fingers, for faith. But in a world where physical illness and spiritual imbalance were intertwined, the king's touch was not merely about wellness. It was about worth, to be seen, to be held, to be blessed, however briefly, by the very hand that wore the crown. And so the strange became sacred. The king, in his robes and rings, bent his head over a beggar's wounds, and for a moment, power looked like tenderness, like contact, like grace. It was not only about healing the body, it was about restoring a sense of order, a quiet belief that somewhere in the folds of this imperfect world, a touch could still change something. To bathe is to be vulnerable. Even now in the modern world, bathing remains an act of privacy, of retreat. But in the medieval court, privacy was not the norm for royalty, especially not for queens. And in one of the most delicate paradoxes of power, bathing, an act so intimate, often became public performance. The higher one's station, the more eyes were present. And for queens, there were few moments more quietly strange than the ritual of the royal bath. Queens did not wash alone. That was neither expected nor permitted. Her attendants, a circle of noblewomen, servants, and sometimes physicians, guided the entire process. Hot water was brought in brass pitchers. Steeped with herbs and oils, sheets or tapestries might be hung for modesty, but often only partially. The queen would undress slowly, piece by piece, and step into a wooden or metal tub lined with linen. Even this simple act was surrounded by hierarchy. Who could hand her the towel? Who held the scented cloth? Who stood nearest? At first glance, this might seem humiliating, but to the medieval court, it was ritual. Every movement reinforced structure. The queen's body, like the king's, belonged not solely to herself, but to the realm. It carried the future of the dynasty, through childbirth, through appearance, through symbolic purity, and the bath was part of that symbolism, cleansing not just of skin, but of spirit, a soft preparation for feast, ceremony, or conjugal bed. Accounts from royal households speak of bathtubs placed near hearths, surrounded by flower petals or fresh rushes. The water was not always clear. It might be tinted with milk or wine, or infused with rosemary or marjoram. A small tray might float in the tub, carrying sweetmeats or goblets of spiced drink. The queen might speak with her ladies, laughing softly, or sit silently while her hair was washed, combed, and braided. It was an hour of luxury, yes, but also one of exposure. Certain queens turned the ritual into statement. Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, was known to bathe in public view on occasion, seated in perfumed water surrounded by scented smoke and embroidered screens. Some took pride in their beauty, using the bath not to hide, but to display gracefully, strategically, as one might a precious relic. Others endured it with quiet resignation, aware that even this most personal act was never entirely their own. The act of bathing, rare and ceremonial for many medieval people, carried heightened weight at court. Cleanliness was not just about health, it was about image, virtue, control. To be seen bathing meant one was worth tending to. To be surrounded while doing so was not humiliation, but affirmation that you were cared for, attended, guarded. In this way, the bath became a kind of throne, and so the queen bathed, not in solitude, but in ritual, with hands upon her, voices around her, cloth and steam and light moving across her skin. It was strange, yes, but it was also beautiful, in a quiet and layered way. The bath was not escape, it was participation, a soft act wrapped in a hard world. Before the rise of science as we know it, the stars were not distant, in different points of light. They were living signs, placed, patterned, meaningful. And in the medieval court, no decision of weight was made without first consulting the sky. Kings and queens, surrounded by scholars and priests, often kept one more figure close at hand, the royal astrologer. Not a curiosity, not a fringe voice, but a trusted advisor, one who read the heavens like a book of fate. To the medieval mind, astrology was not superstition, it was order. The same God who created the earth had also arranged the firmament. The movement of stars and planets, then, was not random, it was divine language. To ignore that language would be to court chaos. And so, on the eve of war, at the hour of a birth, or before the signing of a treaty, the court would fall quiet and wait for the stars to speak. Astrologers occupied a strange space in the royal household. Half scholar, half mystic, often trained in medicine, mathematics, and theology, they tracked the movement of the heavens through delicate instruments and painstaking tables. They would cast horoscopes, not only for individuals, but for entire reigns. Was the moon in Scorpio? Then delay the journey. Was Saturn rising? Then beware the counsel of your nobles. Even coronations were timed to align with auspicious skies. In 12th century England, King Stephen's court reportedly hesitated to act until the astrologer's charts had been consulted. In France, Catherine de' Medici surrounded herself with seers and sky readers, blending fear and fascination with her political strategy. And further east, emperors had entire observatories built to track omens, eclipses, and celestial alignments, vast stone instruments whose shadows marked the will of the divine. But astrology was never entirely safe. Its closeness to heresy made the church uneasy. Divination was frowned upon, unless, of course, it was cloaked in the language of observation and timing. So astrologers walked a delicate line. They spoke in symbols, not absolutes. They offered warnings, not commands. And yet, behind palace doors, their influence ran deep. A single chart could delay a wedding. A troubling conjunction could sow suspicion or halt an invasion. Royal births, especially, were draped in astrological meaning. A prince born under Jupiter's eye might be seen as blessed with justice and strength. A child born under a waning moon might carry omens of instability. Midwives, too, sometimes marked the hour of birth not only for record, but for calculation. The stars, it was believed, cast long shadows. To know a child's future, one must know the hour they first cried. And so the throne room, for all its gilded certainty, often turned upward in uncertainty. The king stood in ermine and crown, yes, but he listened quietly to a man pointing toward Venus. Power moved not only through armies and laws, but through constellations no sword could reach. And in that stillness, beneath painted ceilings and candlelit halls, one truth endured, that even kings must answer to the sky. We might imagine medieval royal feasts as loud, chaotic affairs, boars roasted whole, goblets overflowing, minstrels singing beside jesters tumbling, and sometimes they were. But beneath the spectacle, the royal table was often a place of strange, solemn ceremony. For all the abundance it offered, it was rarely casual. Every movement was measured, every guest watched. And at the center of it all, the monarch ate slowly, ritually, and often in near total silence. Dining in the medieval court was less about nourishment than display. To be fed was to be seen. In the great halls of kings and emperors, entire meals unfolded as a kind of performance. First came the washing of hands, done with scented water poured by attendants into silver basins. Then the seating of nobles by strict rank, measured not only by bloodline, but by favor and intrigue. To sit too close or too far could be read as an insult or a threat. The king's food was prepared in guarded kitchens, and often tasted by servants before it reached his table. Poison was a constant fear, and food ironically became a matter of danger as much as pleasure. Whole departments were devoted to the preparation and safety of royal meals. The sergeant of the mouth and the yeoman of the buttery each had specific duties, each a link in a chain meant to ensure that the dish was as safe as it was sumptuous. And yet, despite all this labor, the act of eating was strangely restrained. The king or queen rarely spoke during meals. Instead, they ate with slow precision while others looked on. Speaking aloud, especially to the monarch, was often forbidden unless permission was granted. Those seated farther away might talk softly, but the closer one sat to the crown, the quieter the meal became. This silence was not coldness, it was reverence. The sovereign's table was an altar of sorts, and eating was part of the liturgy. The food itself could be elaborate, to the point of surreal. Gilded pies filled with live birds, sugar sculptures taller than a man, swans dressed in their own feathers, reassembled and posed as if still gliding through water. These dishes were never meant to be practical. They were meant to astonish, to remind the court and visiting dignitaries that royal power could reshape even nature into spectacle. But behind the wonder, there was tension. Not all who dined at court were free to enjoy the meal. Etiquette manuals instructed nobles on exactly how to hold a knife, how to tear bread, how to wipe their mouths without offense. Every gesture could be scrutinized. A drop of sauce, a misused spoon, a bite taken too early. These were more than breaches of manners. They were cracks in the image of courtly control. And for those climbing the treacherous ladder of royal favor, a misplaced crumb could be fatal. And so, the royal meal was both strange and sacred, a place of abundance, yet constraint, of ceremony, yet appetite. A moment in the day when the body was nourished, yes, but also when power was rehearsed, reinforced, and observed. In this quiet theater of bread and meat, the monarch dined not as a person, but as a symbol. And the watching eyes, hungry not only for food, but for favor, never blinked. In the medieval world, power followed the royal body everywhere, not just into the throne room or the battlefield, but into the bath, the bedchamber, and even the latrine. To serve a monarch meant attending to their most private needs, and among the strangest roles in any royal court was the position of the groom of the stool, a servant tasked with assisting the king as he relieved himself. It sounds absurd, but for centuries, this was one of the most intimate and powerful roles in the kingdom. The royal toilet, or garderobe, was not a simple affair. It might be built into the thick stone of the palace wall, with a shaft dropping down into the moat or a cesspit below. In grander households, it could take the form of a padded wooden seat over a ceramic bowl lined with linen, and it was never used alone. The king's body, after all, was sacred. Vulnerable moments had to be guarded, sometimes literally, sword in hand, and tended to with ritual dignity. The groom of the stool was responsible for preparing the chamber, managing the linens, and assisting in the cleaning process itself. He handed the king the cloth, often perfumed, and ensured nothing went wrong. But he did more than this. He was often present during the monarch's quietest, most unguarded moments, and in this peculiar closeness, he became a confidant, a whisperer, a man who knew the king, not just in public, but in flesh, breath, and weakness. Far from being a lowly role, it was a position of immense trust. The groom often came from noble blood. He had access to secrets no advisor or general would ever hear. Henry VIII's grooms, for instance, were some of the most influential men at court, given estates, pensions, and the king's ear on matters far beyond hygiene. They controlled the royal schedule, correspondence, even financial records. They stood by the monarch when no one else could. To the medieval mindset, this arrangement was not humorous, it was necessary. The body of the monarch was both sacred and functional. It had to be maintained, honored, and served. Cleanliness was tied to moral order, and to protect the king's body in its most vulnerable state was to protect the kingdom's body politic. The groom of the stool didn't just hold towels, he held proximity, and with it extraordinary influence. Queens, too, were not left to privacy. Their maids of honor, ladies-in-waiting, and chamberwomen assisted them in everything from dressing to childbirth, to the quiet duties of cleanliness. It was an understood reality of royal life. Intimacy was never entirely your own. The royal body was public property. It had to be watched, dressed, managed, and when necessary, cleaned. And so this strange practice, so foreign to modern dignity, becomes more legible through time's lens. It was about more than excretion. It was about hierarchy, ritual, and power. The body, with all its mundane needs, could not be ignored. Even kings needed help, and the one who stood nearest when all robes were removed was often the one who understood most clearly what it meant to rule, not with a crown, but with a cloth. Death, for medieval royalty, was never the end of presence. Even in death, a king or queen's body was a symbol, heavy with meaning, layered in ritual, and sometimes it was not kept whole. Among the stranger customs of medieval monarchy was the practice of dividing the royal corpse, burying the heart in one place, the entrails in another, and the bones in yet another tomb entirely. Not out of disrespect, but out of devotion, out of duty, out of a belief that the body of a ruler could belong in more than one place at once. We see it most clearly in the case of Richard the Lionheart, who died in 1199. His body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. But his heart, removed carefully, washed with spices, was interred at Rouen Cathedral in the capital of Normandy. His entrails were buried at the site of his death, in Chachalouth. 3 cities, 3 tombs, 1 man, each part placed where it held political or spiritual meaning. It was not grotesque, it was symbolic. To modern minds, such division feels unsettling. But in the medieval imagination, the body was not a sealed vessel. It was a landscape of meaning. The heart might represent love, loyalty, or divine right. The bones were lineage, what could endure. The entrails, though unclean, were necessary to prepare the body for sanctified burial. And in separating these parts, medieval mourners were not desecrating the dead, they were distributing the sacred. This practice was not limited to Richard. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, had her heart taken to Blackfriars in London, while her body was interred in Westminster Abbey. The French kings often had their organs buried at the Abbey of Saint Denis, even when the rest of the body lay elsewhere. The logic was theological as much as practical. Long journeys in a warm climate could rot a royal corpse, so the body was embalmed, purged, and in some cases portioned. There was also power in presence. A tomb drew pilgrims, prayers, and prestige. To leave a part of the monarch behind, a rib, a tooth, a lock of hair was to anchor authority in that place. It made the monarch eternal, present in multiple cities, invoked by multiple peoples. The grave was never just a resting place, it was a site of memory, miracle, and allegiance. And then there was the ritual of burial itself. The monarch's corpse, wrapped in cloth of gold, was paraded slowly, sometimes for weeks. Bells tolled, mourners wailed in prescribed cadences. The funeral was not just grief, it was instruction, a moment for the kingdom to be reminded. Though the body lies still, the crown lives on. A squire might hold the sword, a bishop might lift the heart, a new king might walk beside the coffin, already wearing the weight of what was past. So when we think of these strange divisions, hearts in reliquaries, bones beneath abbey floors, tombs with nothing inside, we are not seeing fragmentation, we are seeing devotion. A world that believed the body of a monarch could be more than one thing, in more than one place, for more than one reason. The body, like the crown, did not belong to one person. It belonged to history. We often imagine a bedroom as the last refuge of privacy. A door closed, a candle dimmed, a moment to be utterly alone. But for medieval royalty, the bedchamber was rarely private. In fact, it was often one of the most public rooms in the palace. It was here, in soft candlelight and under carved wooden beams, that some of the strangest customs of royal life played out. Not in grandeur, but in exposure. The royal bed was not a sanctuary, it was a stage. The king did not go to bed alone, nor did he wake alone. Courtiers, servants, and officials moved in and out according to custom, each with defined roles. There were watchers of the hearth, testers of the bedding, even designated gentlemen of the bedchamber, whose job was to remain close through the night, on call for any royal need. In some courts, a group of elite attendants slept in the same room, lying on pallets by the door, guarding both the monarch's life and dignity as he rested. This proximity was not only about safety, it was also about ritual. In certain courts, especially in France and later England, aspects of the king's waking and sleeping were performed publicly. The monarch's rising lever and retiring couche were formal events. Nobles of standing were invited to witness the undressing, the laying down, and the final prayers of the sovereign. Not for voyeurism, but for legitimacy. A king's day began and ended in the eyes of the court. The royal bed itself reflected this strange duality. It was massive, often raised high on platforms, surrounded by curtains of silk or velvet. The bedposts were carved with saints, animals, and heraldic signs. In some cases, the monarch slept alone. In others, especially for queens, ladies-in-waiting remained nearby, sleeping in adjoining spaces or even on the same bedding. The royal body, like the crown, was rarely out of sight. There was political theater even in rest. Marriage consummations were witnessed. Births were public, with nobles and midwives present to ensure legitimacy. Even death, when it came, happened under eyes. The last breath of a king or queen might be attended by dozens, watching to confirm the moment power passed from one body to another. In this way, the bed was never just a place of sleep, it was a site of state transition. Yet within these constraints, moments of humanity surfaced. Whispered conversations in the dark, shared laughter between ruler and servant, a monarch in nightclothes sighing over old wounds. These glimpses were rare and fleeting, but they mattered, for in the medieval court, to serve in the bedchamber was not merely to wait on the king, it was to see him, to witness the gap between symbol and self. And so, while we may find it strange, the constant presence, the ceremonial sleeping, the absence of solitude, it made perfect sense in its time. The royal bedchamber was not designed for comfort. It was designed for continuity, to ensure the body of the king, even in its most vulnerable state, remained visible, guarded, and known, a strange kind of intimacy, a public privacy, and a quiet reminder that in the world of medieval power, even rest had witnesses. To look into a mirror is to meet oneself, or so we think today. But for medieval royalty, reflections were never neutral. A mirror was more than a polished surface. It was a doorway, a judgment, a danger. In the royal courts of the Middle Ages, mirrors were rare, precious, and often deeply feared. To gaze into one too long was, in some corners of belief, to risk something more than vanity. It was to see what should remain hidden. The earliest medieval mirrors were not glass, but polished metal, bronze, silver, or tin, carefully buffed to reflect a cloudy image. They were costly, prone to distortion, and often passed through noble hands like enchanted relics. In courts from Byzantium to Burgundy, these objects were treated with caution, not merely because they were valuable, but because their meanings were tangled. Mirrors reflected more than the face. Some believed they revealed the soul. For royalty, whose bodies were wrapped in symbols and sacred meaning, this was no small matter. A king might be warned against looking too long into a mirror before battle, lest he see an omen in his own eyes. Queens were advised by superstitious handbooks not to hold mirrors while pregnant, fearing that fearful thoughts might scar the child. In more mystical traditions, reflections were said to harbor spirits, even demons. A mirror dropped and broken could signal catastrophe. And yet mirrors held fascination too. Some monarchs became obsessed. Charles VI of France, who suffered from severe mental illness, was reportedly disturbed by his own reflection. He sometimes refused to bathe or change clothes, convinced that if he looked in a mirror, he would not see a king. In other moments, he claimed to be made of glass, terrified he might shatter. His attendants removed all reflective surfaces from his chambers, walking carefully, whispering softly. Even the sunlight was managed. In contrast, rulers like Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire studied optics and reflection with scientific zeal. To him, the mirror was a tool, a way of understanding light, distance, self. But even among learned courts, the line between science and superstition was thin. Court magicians and astrologers sometimes used polished bowls or obsidian discs for scrying, attempting to read visions from the mirrored surface. The monarch's reflection, when consulted, was sometimes believed to reveal truths not visible in daylight. In a deeper sense, the unease surrounding mirrors reflected the unease with kingship itself. A monarch ruled by divine right, yes, but he or she was still mortal, fragile, flawed. To look into a mirror was to be reminded. The crown might glitter, but the face beneath it aged. The hands trembled, the eyes blinked. In a world where the king's image was carefully managed, carved in stone, painted in oil, whispered about from afar, a mirror could be unsettlingly honest. And so, mirrors in medieval palaces were covered more often than admired, dressed in velvet, kept in cabinets, brought out with ceremony. They were not decor, they were instruments, sometimes feared, sometimes revered, always handled with care. For in the medieval court, to see oneself clearly was not always a comfort. It was a risk, and sometimes, for a king or queen surrounded by flatterers and faith, the truest danger lay not in battle, but in a quiet, silvered face looking back. The birth of a royal child was never just a private affair. It was an event heavy with symbolism, hope, and scrutiny, an unfolding ritual in which the child was not born into the arms of their parents, but into the grasp of a waiting kingdom. Everything from the moment of labor to the naming of the infant was observed, recorded, blessed, and managed. A prince or princess came into the world not simply as a baby, but as a vessel of dynastic continuity. And the ceremonies that marked their earliest days were some of the strangest in medieval life. It began even before the child emerged. When a queen entered labor, her chambers were transformed into what was known as a lying-in room. Windows were shuttered, walls were draped in heavy tapestries, light was dimmed, the air was made thick with incense, chants, and whispered prayers. Men were generally barred from the room, save for priests and in some cases physicians. Midwives guided the process, assisted by noblewomen, sometimes more than a dozen. The queen labored not in solitude, but in a sanctified cocoon of expectation. When the child was born, the moment had to be witnessed, often literally. Noble courtiers, bishops, and members of the household gathered just outside the chamber, waiting for confirmation. It was common practice, particularly with male heirs, for at least one or more official witnesses to be present at the moment of birth, not to intrude, but to ensure legitimacy. In an age of succession crises and pretenders, no detail could be left to trust alone. The body of the child was proof, but only if it was seen. Baptism followed swiftly. It was not only a spiritual rite, but a political performance. The infant, often still red and swaddled, was carried to the chapel, sometimes in a cradle of gold or velvet, surrounded by candles and cloaked clergy. The water was holy, but the atmosphere was theatrical. Godparents were carefully chosen, usually monarchs or nobles from allied houses, and the naming of the child, whispered into the ear by the priest, was an act of strategy as much as heritage. A name could honor the past or claim a future. Then came the rituals of protection. The infant was anointed, not only for blessing, but to ward off evil. Tiny crosses were traced onto the skin. Amulets might be sewn into the wrappings. Relics of saints were placed near the cradle. Some courts even hung protective herbs, rosemary, vervain, or rue, above the infant's sleeping space, to ward off spirits or illness. And for weeks or months, the child might be seen only by a handful of carefully chosen eyes. The royal body, even in infancy, required shielding. Childhood itself, for royal offspring, was a careful balancing act of distance and symbolism. Few were raised directly by their parents. Wet nurses, governesses, tutors, and attendants surrounded them. Each role was appointed with care. Even toys had meaning. Miniature swords, carved lions, embroidered robes. These were not playthings. They were training, preparations for a life lived under constant attention. Royal children were spoken to not as toddlers, but as future sovereigns. Their gestures watched, their illnesses chronicled. And so, from the moment of their first breath, a royal child was enveloped in ritual. They did not simply grow. They were grown, shaped by forces larger than any nursery. Their birth was a heralded event, their sleep guarded, their tears witnessed by courtiers. In this strange blend of reverence and control, the child was never entirely a person, not yet. They were a promise, a legacy in waiting. And around their small, swaddled bodies, the machinery of monarchy quietly turned. To rule a kingdom was to walk a path through shadows. For all their titles and armies, medieval monarchs often turned to signs, small flickers of the uncanny, to guide their steps. In a world shaped as much by faith as by fear, omens held weight, and none more so than those carried by animals. From the flutter of a bird's wing to the twitch of a hound's ear, the courts of kings and queens were filled with watchful eyes, interpreting nature's quiet messages. It began with birds. Their flight was thought to speak of future things, especially crows, owls, and ravens. To see a raven perched upon the palace gate before dawn was an ill sign, a whisper of betrayal. A dove landing near a chapel, by contrast, might be seen as a symbol of divine favor. Monarchs consulted augurs and wise men, asking not just what birds were seen, but how they flew, left to right or right to left. The angle of wings might determine whether a treaty would be signed or an army would march. Dogs, too, were closely watched. A hound that refused to eat, or howled without cause, was feared to be sensing a death. Cats, especially black ones, were treated with caution in many courts, viewed by some as witches' familiars or omens of unrest. And yet in other lands, they were protected. In ancient Egypt and in parts of medieval Islamic courts, cats were seen as sacred, clean, even royal in their own right. In Christian Europe, the lines were more blurred. A queen might cradle a kitten in private, and yet cross herself if one blocked her path. Unusual births among animals were cause for alarm. A two-headed calf or a malformed foal was taken not as a biological curiosity, but a sign of corruption, divine warning, or unnatural sin in the land. Chronicles from the time are filled with such accounts. Lambs born with human faces, chickens crowing at midnight, a mare giving birth to a serpent. Whether real or imagined, these stories shaped decisions. At times, they even changed history. There were favored creatures, too. White stags, for example, were considered sacred and rare. To see one was a message from God, or a call to quest. In Arthurian legend and royal hunting traditions, the appearance of a white stag often marked the beginning of transformation. Kings would call off entire hunts to pursue one, believing it led to destiny. And in some royal courts, the white stag was seen not only as a prize, but as a guide, a silent herald from the divine. Even the timing of animal sounds mattered. A rooster crowing in the dead of night could spark fear. A fox seen near the palace grounds might signal treachery among advisors. Monarchs wore charms against such signs, amulets made from feathers, claws, or bones. These were not simply folk beliefs. They were interwoven with governance. A king might delay an audience or cancel a journey based on what the animals had done that morning. And none would dare call it foolish. So much of royal superstition was about control or the fear of losing it. In a world where plague, rebellion, and death came swiftly, rulers sought meaning in what they could observe, and the creatures that moved just outside their walls, silent, strange, instinctive, became part of the monarchy's unwritten language. Even in palaces of stone, with maps and heralds and laws, the flutter of a sparrow or the lowing of a cow could still stir something ancient, something older than thrones. Clothing, for a medieval monarch, was never simply about warmth or elegance. It was a form of language woven not just from thread, but from law, lineage, and belief. Every cloak, every sleeve, every thread of embroidery was chosen with care, because it declared rank, piety, mood, and intention. And the deeper one looks into the garments of royalty, the more it becomes clear. Dressing the monarch was as strange and as sacred as crowning them. In most medieval courts, specific colors were reserved for royalty. Chief among them was purple, a dye so costly, so laborious to produce, that only kings and emperors could afford to wear it regularly. It was made from the mucus of sea snails, thousands of them, boiled down into a pigment known as Tyrian purple. Roman emperors had first claimed it, but the practice lingered well into the Middle Ages. In Byzantium, children born to reigning emperors were said to be born in the purple, literally born in rooms draped with the dye, to signal their right to rule. Then came crimson, the color of power and spectacle. Rich and dramatic, it was often made from the crushed bodies of cochineal insects or imported dye plants. To wear crimson at court was to stand in the heat of the king's gaze. Gold woven into actual thread or beaten into leaf and applied to fabric was the color of divine favor. But it wasn't only color that mattered. It was shape. Long sleeves meant leisure and rank. Shorter, tighter garments were for laborers or lesser courtiers. Shoes with exaggerated pointed toes, called poulaines, were signs of wealth, as they made walking nearly impossible. For coronations and ceremonies, Kings were wrapped in layers of symbolic meaning. A simple white tunic underneath to show purity, then a red robe for the blood of kingship, then a golden mantle studded with jewels clasped at the chest by relics or sacred brooches. Each layer was placed by specific hands, bishops, stewards, noble kin. The act of dressing was not private. It was almost liturgical, and once clothed, the monarch was transformed, not just into a ruler, but into a walking emblem of their people. Queens, too, were dressed with symbolism. Veils and girdles reflected chastity and fertility. Embroidery told stories of saints, battles, beasts, and bloodlines. A single border might take months to stitch. Some royal women wore garments sewn with tiny pearls or sapphires, meant not just to display wealth, but to reflect heavenly light. A queen's gown shimmered in candlelight, not just for beauty, but as a quiet echo of the celestial. And when a queen mourned, her black or gray garments were often laced with silver thread to catch the eye, even in grief. What seems strangest now is how codified it all was. Laws were passed, sumptuary laws, to forbid commoners from wearing certain fabrics or dyes. Only nobles could wear ermine or certain types of fur. Only royalty could wear cloth of gold. Violations were punished, because clothing wasn't just fashion, it was a form of national grammar. To blur the line between royal and common was to invite social collapse, or so it was feared. And so the royal wardrobe was not just a closet, it was a treasury, a reliquary, a signal tower. Within it hung the very symbols of sovereignty. A cloak was not merely draped, it was inherited, consecrated, watched, and when the monarch entered a hall, every eye read them before they spoke. In their fabric, their hue, their cut, they carried 1,000 unspoken words, some strange, some sacred, all woven into the weight of the crown. In the medieval world, defeat was rarely silent. When kings fell, they did not vanish into obscurity. They were seen, paraded, displayed, sometimes preserved like artifacts. Power was a spectacle, and so too was its undoing. For medieval monarchs, to be captured alive in war was not always a death sentence. Sometimes it was worse. It meant ritual humiliation, a slow unmaking of status. And in its strange, brutal way, this too was ceremony. When King John of Bohemia died at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, blind and fighting bravely, his body was not treated with cruelty, but his banner, his legend, was co-opted by the victors. Edward the Black Prince adopted John's motto, Ich dien, or I serve, as a badge of honor. Even in death, a king's symbols were taken, altered, reworn by the conqueror. This was a kind of soft humiliation, not of the flesh, but of memory. But for the living, the rituals were far more direct. King John II of France, after being captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, was brought to England and paraded through London, not in chains, but in public view, dressed richly, yet carefully controlled. He was lodged in the Savoy, treated with courtesy, but always watched. The very presence of a captive king walking foreign streets was a message, not just that he had lost, but that the captor now controlled how he was seen. Sometimes, humiliation was more theatrical. Nobles who rebelled against their monarch might be forced to ride backward on donkeys, to wear women's garments, or to carry symbols of their failure through the streets, broken swords, snapped lances, or even mock crowns of thorns. These performances were carefully staged, designed to degrade status without drawing blood, because in the medieval imagination, shame could last longer than scars. One of the most extreme examples came in Byzantium, where defeated emperors were often blinded, not out of cruelty alone, but as a political act. A blinded man could not rule. His disfigurement disqualified him, but it also preserved his life, allowing his captors to parade him as a cautionary tale. In one instance, the former Emperor Romanos IV was not only blinded, but displayed in rags before being sent to a monastery to live out his days. Stripped of regalia, he was now a warning. And yet, not all humiliation was physical. The Treaty of Verdun, which divided Charlemagne's empire among his grandsons, was accompanied by ceremonial oaths sworn in multiple languages, a recognition that unity had failed and that the empire had fractured. Even treaties could humiliate, to kneel before another monarch, to kiss the hand of a former enemy, to cede land and write it in ink. These acts, though bloodless, were deeply cutting. Stranger still were the golden cages, luxurious prisons for noble captives. These were not dungeons, but comfortable confinements, fine food, soft beds, but no freedom. A gilded life without movement. For some princes, this lasted years, and perhaps the strangest truth of all was that these humiliations worked. They reminded courtiers, soldiers, even rival kings that power was fragile, that the difference between a throne and a cell could be a single battle, a single breath. When a monarch died in the Middle Ages, the body did not pass quietly into the earth. It lingered in ritual, in symbol, in scent and shadow. Death for royalty was not a moment, it was a process. And surrounding that process were layers of belief, some sacred, some superstitious, all woven into the long, strange journey from breath to burial. These were not just customs, they were protections against unrest, against bad luck, and perhaps most of all, against forgetting. The moment of death was supposed to be witnessed. A monarch rarely died alone. Priests and confessors were summoned, often weeks or days in advance if illness allowed. A dying king would be anointed one final time, on the hands, the feet, the chest, the lips. Psalms were whispered, and the body was turned to face east, toward the rising sun, toward resurrection. But when death came, a silence often fell, a pause, as if no one dared speak it aloud. Then came the strange parts. In England and France especially, the heart and entrails were often removed and buried separately. The body was washed in wine or vinegar, then wrapped in cloth of gold. If the monarch had died far from home, their remains might be embalmed with spices, cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, and packed in salt or straw for the journey. It was said that scent guided the soul upward, but it also helped mask the decay. Candles were lit and never extinguished. In some courts, 40 days of light burned beside the coffin. Mirrors were covered, windows draped. It was believed that the spirit, newly separated, might be confused, might try to return. Reflections were seen as dangerous. A dead monarch glimpsing themselves in a mirror might linger, refusing to move on. So the glass was hidden, the bells were muffled, and the palace fell into hushed rhythms of ritual and watch. In certain traditions, the royal physician was summoned not to heal, but to publicly confirm the death, to touch the body, to speak the words aloud. The proclamation was not just for courtiers, it was for the land. In some ceremonies, the death was announced 3 times, in different places of the palace, as if to help the soul understand it had passed. Messengers were then dispatched on horseback in every direction, to carry black-sealed letters to churches, castles, and rival courts. And always, the body was displayed, first in silence, then with increasing solemnity. A wax effigy might be placed on the coffin, so mourners could glimpse the monarch in idealized form, alive in image, even as the real body lay beneath. In some cases, the coffin itself was opened periodically to show the incorruptibility of the flesh. Other times, it was sealed forever, placed in a tomb of stone, with carved lions or saints guarding the feet. But perhaps the strangest ritual came in the form of the funeral regalia reversal. A monarch might be buried wearing crown, orb, and scepter, but deliberately turned the wrong way, the sword pointing downward, the scepter in the left hand, not the right. It was a message: this power now sleeps. It was also a protection, a kind of spiritual quarantine. Death, after all, was contagious, not just medically, but cosmically. One life's ending could unbalance the world, if not sealed carefully. And so, amid incense and black cloth, choirs and tolling bells, the royal body was laid to rest. But even in rest, it remained watched, guarded by stone, by candle, by prayer. Death did not end a monarch's hold on the land. In many ways, it transformed it, a strange sleep beneath marble, from which memory would rise, generation after generation, asking not what the king had done, but what he had left behind. To be a monarch was to be watched, always watched, every gesture recorded, every movement shadowed by ceremony. But even kings and queens sometimes longed for something else. A moment of solitude, a glimpse of the world, not shaped by fear or flattery. And in rare, quiet chapters of history, some rulers slipped away, not to hunt, not to conquer, but to walk, to join the old roads with pilgrims and penitents. And they did it in disguise. Pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was not an idle journey, it was a vow, a walking prayer. People of all ranks traveled, rich and poor, young and aged, barefoot or riding, to sacred places, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, Jerusalem. They walked not for comfort, but for redemption, or healing, or hope. For kings, pilgrimage held added meaning. It was a public act of humility, and yet sometimes it became something more unusual, a chance to be, for a moment, unknown. Henry II of England, burdened with guilt over the murder of Thomas Becket, famously walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury in 1174, dressed in penitential robes, allowing monks to flog him at the cathedral's gate. But even that was public penance, performance, perhaps, as much as faith. More curious are the stories of monarchs who went further, shedding their royal identity altogether, traveling in secret among the faithful. James IV of Scotland was said to have wandered to shrines in disguise, mingling with common travelers. Some tales tell of Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, traveling to holy sites in simple woolen robes, refusing the comforts of court, even when recognized. These were not always verified events. Some blur into legend, but their persistence in record and memory tells us what people wanted to believe, that even a king might kneel beside a beggar, unnoticed. Disguise in pilgrimage had its risks. Monarchs could be vulnerable without guards, and recognition could spark chaos. But the idea held deep appeal. To walk as an equal, to sleep in straw, to eat coarse bread, to pray aloud in a language no one answered with a title. This was not a rejection of power, but a reminder of what came before it. A soul, alone with its silence, moving across the land towards something sacred. Of course, most royal pilgrimages were grand affairs. Dozens of horses, wagons of vestments, bishops and knights in procession. Even when disguised, the royal body betrayed itself by bearing, by courtesy, by silence that expected respect. But even then, in the quiet between towns, something shifted. A monarch felt the weather, felt the stones underfoot, heard a child laugh without bowing. For a little while, the layers peeled away, and when they returned changed, not always in politics, but in posture. A pilgrim's dust still clinging to royal boots, a memory of anonymity folded quietly beneath the crown. In those brief, strange journeys, when a king walked as no one and prayed like everyone, power found its pause, and the path, old and winding, continued on beneath them, as it always had, long before thrones were built. In an age before printed maps and modern law, the guidance a king most often sought did not come from books or councils. It came from the unseen, from relics wrapped in silk, from bones resting beneath altars, from objects so sacred that to touch them bare-handed was thought to invite divine judgment. Medieval monarchs, surrounded by banners and bloodshed, often turned not to generals or scribes, but to saints, or what remained of them. A relic, in the medieval world, was not a metaphor. It was not symbolic. It was physical, utterly real. A shard of bone, a lock of hair, a scrap of cloth worn by a holy figure. The more complete the relic, the greater its power. The more famous the saint, the more potent the object. And in royal courts across Europe, these objects were not hidden in corners of churches. They were carried in procession, laid before thrones, kissed by kings with trembling reverence. Some relics were part of daily ritual. Charlemagne kept a cache of holy bones and fragments in his private chapel. Louis IX of France went further, building the breathtaking Sainte-Chapelle in Paris solely to house the crown of thorns, which he had acquired at immense cost. He carried it barefoot through the city, not as a relic keeper, but as a penitent, not as a ruler, but as a servant of holiness. In moments of crisis, kings would bring out relics as if to consult them, not for voices, but for presence. The belief was not that the relics spoke, but that they radiated, that they offered alignment. To pray beside the skull of a martyred saint was to re-enter the current of divine wisdom. A king might spend a night in vigil before a bone relic, before making a decision of war or marriage, not seeking a vision necessarily, but waiting for a kind of inner clarity brought on by nearness to the sacred. And if that clarity came, it was trusted more than any human counsel. Relics were also moved strategically, taken to battlefields to bless troops, or paraded through plague-struck cities to ask for mercy. Monarchs placed them beneath their beds, beside their dining tables, or within the walls of castles. It was common to find the bones of saints sealed into the very stones of a new cathedral, or beneath the coronation dais of a king, as if the sacred dead could witness and ratify the acts of the living. But sometimes, the reverence bordered on the strange. Emperor Henry II was known to consult the relics of Saint Emmeram, sleeping beside them before campaigns. Other monarchs commissioned golden reliquaries in the shape of hands or feet, jeweled lifelike containers to house the fragmented remains of saints. These were not mere curiosities. They were, in the eyes of the faithful, alive, still working miracles, still carrying wisdom, even centuries after death. To the modern eye, it can feel surreal, kings consulting splinters of bone, kneeling before teeth or finger joints. But in the medieval imagination, time was porous. Death was not the end of influence, and kings, for all their earthly power, still feared the judgment of heaven. In relics, they found a bridge between worlds, a strange holy guidance, and though the saints did not speak, their silence often said enough. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the candles had burned low and the royal bedchamber lay hushed, dreams arrived, and in the medieval court, dreams were never taken lightly. For monarchs, they were not dismissed as the mind's wanderings. They were portals, messages, tations, warnings. A king's dream could stir armies. A queen's vision could delay a coronation. In a world where heaven and earth were thought to brush shoulders in sleep, royal dreams became matters of state. The belief ran deep and old. In biblical tradition, kings like Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar had their dreams interpreted by prophets. That legacy lingered into the medieval mind. If God spoke to rulers in visions, it was not only possible, it was expected. Monarchs were seen as divinely chosen, their souls especially attuned to signs. And so when they dreamed, they listened. Or rather, others listened for them. There were dream interpreters at many courts, clerics, physicians, or learned men trained in the symbolic language of sleep. Entire books were written on the meanings of dreams. A white horse meant victory. A river foretold separation. Blood could mean war or purification, depending on how it flowed. The dreamer's station mattered too. A nobleman dreaming of fire might be warned of scandal, but if a king saw fire, it could mean rebellion or divine trial. Context shaped everything. Sometimes, the dreams were public. Before the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, It's said that King Henry V spoke of an ominous dream, one involving crows descending on his banner. His priests fasted and prayed through the night, offering masses in response. At other times, dreams remained whispered secrets, passed only to confessors or trusted advisors. Some monarchs kept journals of their visions, believing they charted the course of fate. One of the most curious accounts comes from Constantine the Great, centuries earlier, who reportedly dreamed of a cross in the sky with the words "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." That dream, whether legend or truth, set the tone for centuries. A single night's vision could alter the course of empires. And for medieval kings, such stories were not distant history. They were precedent. They were instruction. But not all dreams were embraced. Some terrified their dreamers. When King Richard III reportedly dreamed of being stabbed by ghosts on the eve of Bosworth Field, it was said he woke agitated, pacing. Whether myth or memory, the story reveals a truth. Dreams, once spoken, could not be unsaid. They hung in the air like fog. They shaped behavior. A monarch who dreamed of betrayal might treat his allies coldly. A queen who dreamed of death might change her will. The realm unknowingly shifted with their sleep. And so, in the dim light of the royal bedchamber, with shadows flickering on painted walls and relics close at hand, the king dreamed, and those dreams, strange and private, became public matters. Courtiers leaned in. Priests prayed harder. The stars were consulted, the timing reconsidered, because in the medieval court, even slumber could speak. And when a monarch stirred from sleep, the kingdom often held its breath. To sit at a royal table in the Middle Ages was to dine in spectacle, but not in peace. Beneath the shining platters and golden goblets lay a constant gnawing fear, poison, the idea that a single bite, a single sip, might carry death hidden in sweetness. For monarchs whose bodies carried the fate of kingdoms, the act of eating became a calculated risk. And so emerged a strange cast of characters, tasters, alchemists, and watchful servants, whose job was not to prepare the food, but to protect the one who ate it. The role of the royal food taster was both humble and terrifying. Usually a trusted servant or courtier, the taster sampled each dish before it was served to the king or queen. They waited minutes, sometimes longer, watching their own bodies for signs of illness. A tremor in the hand, a tightening of the throat, a sudden pallor. These were signals that something was wrong. If they survived, the food was considered safe, and only then would the monarch lift their spoon. But this was not the only line of defense. Food preparation was a tightly guarded process. Kitchens were watched, ingredients tracked, knives counted. In some courts, herbs were kept under lock and key. Lead and arsenic, common elements in certain poisons, could be masked by strong spices or sweeteners. So royal kitchens developed elaborate routines for inspecting sugar, flour, and wine. Some monarchs even kept personal alchemists or apothecaries nearby, not just for healing, but for detecting subtle toxins through smell or flame. Ceremony, too, offered protection. Dishes were often blessed by priests before reaching the royal plate, especially during feasts or in times of unrest. Certain foods like pomegranates, garlic, or wine, mixed with myrrh, were believed to ward off corruption. Silver utensils were prized not only for their beauty, but for their supposed purity, thought to tarnish or discolor in the presence of poison. The meal became a ritual of reassurance as much as nourishment. The deeper the paranoia, the more elaborate the customs. In Byzantium, some emperors were said to eat only from plates that had been sealed in wax and opened by their own hand. Even the Terrible of Russia, though later in time famously employed multiple tasters and rotated dishes at random. In France, certain kings insisted that no food be served unless it passed through the panettrie and échansonnerie, specialized offices dedicated solely to the safety of bread and wine. Yet the role of the taster was more than a shield. It was a symbol of trust. To be appointed as a taster was, in a twisted way, an honor. The taster stood at the edge of danger, their body a silent offering, and many monarchs formed close bonds with these quiet figures, people who knew what the king feared most and faced it for him. Day after day, meal after meal, they were seldom praised, but they were never forgotten. And so beneath the music of lutes, the clink of goblets, and the scent of roasted meats, a strange tension always lingered. The royal meal was never just a feast. It was a gamble, a ceremony of control, carried out with trembling precision. Because in the medieval imagination, betrayal did not always come with armies. Sometimes it came in a bowl of stew, and it was the taster, silent, steady, who stood between the sovereign and the unseen. There was a time, not so long ago, when people believed that the monarch's touch could heal the sick. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but physically, flesh to flesh. In England and France, for centuries, kings and queens were believed to carry divine healing power, passed down through their bloodline. The disease they were most known to cure was called the king's evil, what we now know as scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swelling in the neck, ulcers, and painful glands. It was disfiguring, sometimes deadly, but it was believed that a king's hand could drive it out. The ritual was solemn, intimate, and deeply strange. In great halls or palace chapels, the sick would gather, some brought by family, others by foot from distant villages. They waited in silence, often fasting or praying the night before. When the monarch entered, it was not with the pomp of court. Instead, there was a kind of holy hush. The king would move from one patient to the next, sometimes with music in the background, sometimes in total stillness. Each sufferer knelt. The king touched them on the swollen neck, the brow, or the chest, and whispered a phrase that echoed through generations, "The Lord heal thee." In England, this was often followed by the giving of a touch piece, a small coin, usually gold or silver, marked with the king's likeness. It was not just a gift, it was a relic now, infused with contact, something to be worn around the neck, close to the wound. This practice wasn't a superstition kept in the shadows. It was official. Monarchs scheduled touchings as part of their royal duties. Records from the reign of Edward I show thousands of people touched in a single year. Louis XIV of France touched more than 2,000 in a single ceremony. Even during outbreaks of plague, kings continued the ritual, despite the risk, because for many, the healing touch was more than a tradition. It was proof that the monarch ruled by divine right. Of course, not every case of scrofula was cured. Many were not, but the power of the ritual didn't rely only on its results. It rested in belief, in the solemn quiet of the moment, with the king's hand resting on a fevered neck. Something happened, something between hope and awe. For the sick, it was a last resort. For the court, it was a reaffirmation. And for the monarch, it was a burden. A reminder that the crown was not just metal, it was obligation, pressed into the lives of the suffering. The tradition endured for centuries. Even Queen Anne, in the early 1700s, continued the practice. But by the time of the Enlightenment, medicine had begun to change. Science grew, belief shifted, and the sacred touch lost its grip. William III, skeptical and modern, refused to perform the ritual, and so it faded. Quietly, like a breath from the lips of a long silent king. Yet in its time, it was real. To the kneeling peasant, the hand that touched them was not just royal, it was holy. And for a moment, in that gesture, the distance between king and subject dissolved. There was no throne, no army, no crown, only skin on skin. And the ancient hope that healing might yet come, not from herbs or prayer alone, but from the hand of the one who ruled. To most of us, the idea of marriage brings to mind closeness, shared chambers, shared meals, a quiet life lived side by side. But in the royal courts of medieval Europe, marriage was something quite different. It was not always built on proximity or intimacy. In fact, many kings and queens lived apart for much of the year, sometimes for years at a time, each with their own household, their own castle, their own world. And far from being scandalous, this distance was expected, even necessary. The reasons were many. Politics often came first. A queen might be stationed in a region that required her symbolic presence, a duchy inherited from her family, a borderland in need of peace. A king might be on campaign or moving constantly between royal estates to assert authority across his realm. Medieval governance required movement, and so the royal couple often lived more like two satellites, circling the center of power, rarely fixed in the same place for long. There was also the matter of court economies. Each royal maintained their own household, a full administrative machine, with cooks, scribes, servants, guards, musicians, tutors, priests, and more. It was not simply inefficient to join these two courts, it was impossible. Too many rivalries, too much expense, too many competing agendas. And so the king's household and the queen's household were run as separate but coordinated spheres, each with its own rhythms and loyalties. Despite this distance, the royal marriage was still a powerful bond. It was less about affection, more about alignment. When the king visited the queen's castle, often on feast days or during politically important moments, it was an event. The journey was planned, the chambers were prepared, and for a few nights, the great bed would be assembled, the banners unfurled, and courtiers would pretend, for a time, that husband and wife lived together always. Children were often conceived during these short visits. A queen's pregnancy was sometimes timed to royal progress, and once she had done her duty, produced an heir or two, there was little expectation that the couple would share a roof often. Queens spent long years in their own castles, managing estates, overseeing religious patronage, writing letters, and raising royal children. Many became powerful figures in their own right, not merely wives, but rulers of a parallel court. Strangely, this distance did not always lead to estrangement. In many royal marriages, letters survive, affectionate, sometimes even playful. Some couples grew closer over time through correspondence than they might have in daily company. Distance allowed for diplomacy. It allowed each to be sovereign in their own space. And for many queens, it offered something rare in the medieval world: privacy and influence, unmediated by a husband's constant gaze. So while it may seem odd that kings and queens slept in different beds, in different halls, sometimes in different countries, it made sense in their world. Proximity was not proof of love. Power, in its strange medieval form, often required separation. And across candlelit writing desks and slow journeys on horseback, the threads of royal marriage were spun, not in closeness, but in duty, distance, and the long echoing halls of separate castles. In a world where royal bloodlines were everything, where dynasties rose and fell on the birth of an heir, it may seem unthinkable that a monarch would choose chastity. Yet, scattered through the long corridors of medieval history, there were kings and queens who did exactly that. Some took vows of celibacy after marrying. Others renounced sexual life altogether in devotion to faith, and still others made those choices not out of piety, but out of grief or politics or quiet rebellion. In their time, such decisions were rare, but not unheard of. And always, they were strange. King Edward the Confessor of England is perhaps the most well-known royal to be associated with chastity. Married to Edith of Wessex, he is said to have lived with her in a state of perpetual virginity. The truth of this claim is debated by historians. Some believe it was later hagiography meant to sanctify his reign, but the legend was powerful. It helped earn Edward his title of confessor and his canonization after death. The very idea that a king could rule and remain untouched by carnal life added a layer of divine mystery to his crown. In some cases, these vows were made after children had been born. A queen, having fulfilled her duty by producing heirs, might choose to withdraw from conjugal life. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, reportedly lived in chastity after the death of her husband. So too did Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I. For these women, chastity was a kind of second coronation, not as queen consort, but as a queen of faith. It was a retreat from the physical into the symbolic, often accompanied by increased patronage to churches and monasteries. There were also kings who took vows of celibacy later in life, particularly those who grew weary of war, scandal, or sin. Some were moved by illness or a near-death experience, others by personal revelations. They withdrew from the flesh not because it was shameful, but because it felt like a distraction from something larger, God, salvation, or the burdens of rule. A celibate king was a paradox, both master of the land and servant of heaven, both crowned and consecrated. Of course, such vows did not always sit easily with the court. Advisors fretted, nobles whispered. Dynasties depended on succession, and succession required children. A king who refused to lie with his queen, or who spurned marriage altogether, was a risk to the realm, to peace, to the future. Some were pressured to abandon their vows, others quietly broke them. But those who kept them carved a strange place in history, a path of power tempered by denial. In the monastic tradition, celibacy was expected. For monks and nuns, it was a symbol of spiritual purity. But for kings and queens, it was never just about the soul. It was a political act, a public gesture. To say no to desire was in a way to rise above the mortal coil, to crown the self not with gold, but with discipline. And while the court might not have always understood it, the people often revered it. A chaste ruler was believed to be closer to the divine. And so, even in the most sensual and symbolic courts, amid the velvet, the lineage, the expectation, some monarchs stepped aside from the body. They walked alone in gardens, prayed through the night, and left no heirs. History remembers them as anomalies, but in their silence they told a story too, that power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it turns inward, choosing restraint over legacy. Long before telescopes or satellites, kings and queens turned their gaze upward, not for science, but for certainty. In the great vaulted ceilings of medieval palaces and cathedrals, stars were painted in gold leaf, constellations charted like scriptures. The heavens were not distant, they were directive, and within them medieval monarchs believed lay the fate of their realms, their bodies, their very souls. To rule well, a king needed counsel, and often that counsel came not from courtiers or councils, but from the sky. Astrology in the Middle Ages was not the fringe practice it would later become. It was part of statecraft, medicine, theology. Learned men, often trained in both astronomy and astrology, served as royal advisors. They cast natal charts at birth, calculated planetary alignments before marriages, and predicted auspicious days for treaties, coronations, or war. These weren't vague superstitions. They were meticulous calculations, drawn by hand, based on precise tables and inherited tradition. A monarch's chart was treated like a sacred map. At court, the astrologer held a peculiar status. Part priest, part scientist, part magician, he could be revered or reviled, depending on what the stars said. One of the most famous was Michael Scott, who served Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Fluent in Arabic and Latin, he translated astrological texts from Islamic scholars, and was said to read the future in the movements of Venus and Mars. In England, Roger Bacon wrote that no significant act should be undertaken by a ruler without first consulting the heavens. Kings did not just want predictions, they wanted control. If Saturn loomed heavy in the sky, its influence associated with misfortune and delay might be countered with prayers, charms, or the timing of rituals. A coronation might be postponed by hours or days, just to ensure that the moon was waxing, not waning. An heir's birth might be accompanied by quiet panic if the stars were ill-aligned. Some monarchs even altered official birth records to better match favorable configurations. Queen Elizabeth I, Centuries later, but still shaped by medieval tradition, famously consulted astrologers like John Dee, whose calculations and occult knowledge influenced her timing of public appearances and foreign policy. Dee was more than an advisor. He was a lens through which the queen interpreted the unseen world, and in many ways, he echoed the astrologers of earlier courts, where every lunar eclipse was a warning, every comet a sign of God's pleasure or wrath. The Church's relationship to astrology was complex. While it condemned divination that sought to override divine will, it often allowed for what it called natural astrology, using the stars to understand the rhythms of creation. Monks studied celestial cycles to time prayers, sowing and healing, and kings crowned by God believed their fates were written in both scripture and starlight. To rule rightly, one had to read both. So the sky was not simply beautiful, it was consequential. A canvas of meaning, shifting above the battlements and towers. And as the monarch lay in bed or walked the gardens by torchlight, they knew that far above, something greater was turning. The stars watched, they moved in silence, and in their movement, kings believed the shape of destiny was quietly drawn. The death of a monarch, as we've seen, was never simple. It marked not only the end of a life, but the unmooring of a kingdom, requiring ceremony, witnesses, and symbolic acts to guide the realm from one reign to the next. But when a king or queen died far from home, a new and stranger problem arose: how to bring the body back intact. In a time without refrigeration, the answer was often grimly practical. Some monarchs were embalmed, others were mummified, or most disturbingly boiled. This process, known as mos Teutonicus, or the German custom, was practiced mainly between the 12th and 14th centuries, particularly by European nobility who died on pilgrimage or in battle. The body of the royal or noble dead was carefully dismembered, the flesh separated from the bones, and boiled in water, wine, or vinegar until only clean white bone remained. The bones were then dried, perfumed, wrapped in linen, and carried home, light, portable, and symbolically pure. It sounds shocking to us now, but to medieval minds, the practice was not macabre, it was reverent. The human body, they believed, could not decay in holy lands or battlefield camps without becoming a source of pollution, both physical and spiritual. Flesh was temporary, bones were eternal. To preserve them was not desecration, but devotion. What might seem grotesque today was, to them, a form of purification. Sometimes, different parts of the monarch's body were buried in different locations, each with its own sacred or political meaning. Richard the Lionheart died in France, and his body was divided, his heart interred at Rouen, his entrails buried at Chalus, where he died, and his bones laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey beside his parents. This practice, called dilaceratio corporis, the division of the body, was not uncommon. A monarch's corpse could become a map of loyalties, a relic in pieces. Other rulers were embalmed in more conventional ways. The body might be filled with aromatic herbs, juniper, sage, lavender, and packed with salt to draw out moisture. The skin was sometimes rubbed with balms or resins. In rare cases, the whole body was wrapped and sealed, mummified in the style of ancient custom, placed beneath waxed cloth and stone, not to preserve the appearance, but to honor the vessel that had once carried royal authority. Transport was a challenge. Royal funerals could take weeks, even months, as the body was carried slowly back through villages, forests, and across borders. The journey itself became part of the ceremony. People lined the roads to pay respects to the passing corpse. Priests swung incense, sang hymns, and always, the body or what remained of it was watched over, guarded by noblemen, framed in silence. Because even in death, the monarch still ruled, still mattered, still moved the world. So while we might recoil at the thought of boiling bones or dividing remains, in the medieval imagination, these were acts of care. Strange, yes, but not savage. They reflected a belief that the body of a ruler, even in ruin, held meaning, that it had to be prepared not just for burial, but for memory, for history. And in that preparation, by fire, by salt, by knife, the kingdom was reminded, power may sleep, but it does not disappear. In the medieval court, not all power wore crowns. Some came on 4 legs, winged or cloaked in fur, kept not for labor or loyalty, but for symbolism, living emblems of the monarchy's reach and mystery. To see a lion pacing behind gilded bars, or a snow-white falcon perched on a queen's arm, was not simply to witness a creature, it was to glimpse the mythology of kingship, alive and breathing. These royal beasts, strange and out of place, became part of the pageantry, and sometimes the prophecy of rule. The most famous of these was the royal menagerie, a collection of exotic animals kept within castle grounds or palace walls. In England, the Tower of London housed such a menagerie as early as the 13th century, with records noting the presence of lions, leopards, monkeys, and even an elephant gifted to Henry III by the King of France. The elephant, bewildered by the English climate, was given a special heated house and barrels of red wine. It lived only a short time, but its presence stirred awe, curiosity, and subtle dread. These animals were not mere pets. They were statements, symbols of dominance over nature and distant lands. The rarer the beast, the greater the prestige. Giraffes and camels arrived from Africa, parrots from the east, bears from the cold northern forests. To host such animals at court was to imply a reach beyond the kingdom's borders, that the monarch's influence, like these creatures, was vast, rare, and ungovernable by ordinary rules. Some animals had heraldic meaning, deeply tied to identity and tradition. The lion, long associated with courage and sovereignty, became a mainstay in royal coats of arms. The unicorn, a creature of purity and power, adorned Scottish banners and royal tapestries. The eagle, fierce and unblinking, watched from the standards of emperors. These beasts were not chosen at random. They were carefully selected to project an ideal, often blending myth and meaning in a single image. But live animals also played roles in ceremony. Trained falcons accompanied queens during processions, perched calmly in the chaos of court. White hounds, sleek and silent, walked beside kings in funeral rites. Even horses were dressed in armor and regalia, painted or draped in symbols, turning military parades into choreographed performances. At feasts, exotic birds might be brought out alive, only to be released in the great hall as a spectacle. There were no boundaries between theater, belief, and biology. In some places, animals were believed to sense divine favor or disaster. A dog howling before dawn, a raven circling above the cathedral, a cat vanishing on the night of a coronation, these were interpreted, whispered about, sometimes recorded by chroniclers. The beasts of court were not just decoration. They were omens, watchers, creatures that belonged both to the earth and perhaps to something stranger. And so, in the painted halls of kings, where human voices echoed and gold shimmered in candlelight, a quiet world of creatures moved alongside the crown. They padded and flapped, prowled and perched, silent symbols of a monarch's reach, strangeness, and vulnerability. To rule was to tame the world. But in every beast's unblinking eyes, there remained a reminder: some powers, like the animals themselves, could never truly be contained. Power, in the medieval world, was never entirely secure. Castles could be stormed, nobles could betray, the love of the people could sour in a single season of hunger or war. And so, hidden beneath the opulence of courts and the towering strength of stone walls, many monarchs quietly prepared for the worst. They built tunnels, escape passages, and secret routes woven into the very bones of their palaces. To outsiders, the castle stood impregnable, but the rulers within knew better. They always kept a door open in the dark. Some of these escape routes were little more than narrow staircases, spiraling deep into the rock, accessible through concealed panels behind tapestries or bookcases. Others were long corridors, descending into damp earth, leading out to riverbanks, forests, or hidden gates. A few were architectural marvels, carefully engineered with slopes, drainage, and airflow. Their purpose was simple but vital. If the castle fell, the crown would not. At Warwick Castle in England, a passage known as the Ghost Tower Stair descends sharply from the upper chambers to the River Avon, a potential route for royal flight should attackers breach the gates. Edinburgh Castle is said to have had an escape tunnel, winding beneath the rock, now lost to collapse or legend. And Château de Chinon in France housed a secret passage said to have been used during the 100 Years' War, carved straight through its foundation. These were not escape hatches built in panic. They were often part of the original castle design. Medieval architects worked closely with kings and queens, who understood all too well how quickly loyalty could vanish. A monarch who fled in shame might live to fight another day, but one who stayed too long in a burning throne room, trusting stone and ceremony, might never rise again. The tunnel was not cowardice. It was insurance, a last breath of sovereignty beneath the ground. Even in more peaceful palaces, secret routes served subtler functions. A hidden walkway might connect a royal bedroom to a chapel or private study, away from the eyes of courtiers. Some allowed monarchs to visit lovers or allies in secrecy. Others let them pass undisturbed through wings of the palace, observing without being observed. At Hampton Court, centuries later, Cardinal Wolsey's apartments were connected by hidden doors to the king's private chambers. Power moved best, it seemed, when it could move unseen. The idea of vanishing royalty fascinated the public imagination. Stories spread of kings slipping away just as traitors breached the gates, or of queens fleeing in the dead of night through rain-soaked fields, dressed as peasants, guided only by faith and torchlight. Many of these tales were myth, but some were true. Monarchs had learned over long centuries that glory was public, but survival was always private. So beneath the banners and battlements, under floors trod by knights and ambassadors, ran these narrow veins of fear and foresight. Some still exist, sealed, crumbled, forgotten. Others may remain undiscovered. But each was a reminder that even the most powerful ruler lived with the knowledge that one day they might need to flee. And when that day came, they trusted not the court nor the crown, but the cold, quiet passage waiting beneath their feet. Not every royal ritual was held for a person. Some were held for objects, scepters, crowns, holy swords, or even a piece of fabric. In the medieval imagination, these items were more than tools. They were vessels of meaning, bound to divine authority. And so they were anointed, crowned, guarded, and mourned, almost as if they were alive. In palaces and cathedrals, it was not unusual to find entire ceremonies devoted to things, objects so charged with sacred and political power that their mere presence could quiet a hall. Perhaps the most striking example was the coronation regalia. The crown, the orb, the scepter, and the sword were not simply handed to the monarch on coronation day. They were themselves blessed and processed, carried by high-ranking nobles, laid on altars and sprinkled with holy water. In some cases, the objects were anointed with oil before the monarch was. Their power had to be reaffirmed, as though the ritual flowed from object to person, not the other way around. In France, the sword of Charlemagne, known as Joao's, was presented before the king even entered the cathedral at Reims. It was passed down through centuries of coronations, believed to contain the echoes of empire itself. The sword was cleaned, oiled, wrapped, and unwrapped with as much reverence as a relic, because in some ways it was one. In England, the stone of Scone, placed beneath the coronation throne, was treated not merely as a seat, but as a witness, a conduit of ancient legitimacy. Objects connected to saints were honored even more elaborately. The holy tunic of Trier, believed to be the seamless garment worn by Christ, was kept behind locked doors and shown to the public only on rare occasions, often in the presence of kings. The event could last for weeks, with processions, hymns, and royal decrees surrounding a single unveiling. Monarchs would sometimes kneel before the cloth, not to venerate the relic itself, but to place themselves in alignment with its story. There were rituals for broken swords, fallen banners, even royal seals. When a monarch died, their seal used to authorize laws and proclamations was often ceremonially destroyed, not tossed away, but broken in a deliberate act, surrounded by witnesses. It was a burial of authority, a public moment to mark the end of one reign and the beginning of another. Even the fragments might be kept in state archives, stored like bones of a previous era. One of the most poignant ceremonies was for the banner of the realm. During coronations or major feasts, banners embroidered with the royal insignia were raised, unfurled, or even kissed by officials. If torn in battle, the fabric might be repaired with prayer, its damage treated like a wound. A monarch might fast before receiving a new banner or dedicate it at a shrine. The banner was more than cloth. It was memory, dignity, and fate carried on wind. In these ceremonies, the medieval court revealed something deep and strangely modern, a recognition that symbols carry weight, that objects, when imbued with belief, with story, with blood, can bind people more tightly than laws. And so, in the hush of a chapel, with incense curling through the air, a monarch might stand not before crowds or thrones, but before a sword or a crown, and bow, not to the metal, but to the meaning it held. In the darkest corners of royal chambers, far from the public rituals of church and crown, some monarchs looked for answers in places forbidden among the dead. To seek the counsel of spirits, to pierce the veil between worlds, was considered perilous by the church. Yet in moments of desperation, fear, or obsession, certain kings and queens turned to necromancers, sorcerers, or secret rites meant to conjure what had passed. And history, though it whispers of these moments carefully, does not deny them. Necromancy, in the medieval world, was not always what we imagine. It was rarely about raising the dead in the flesh. More often, it involved calling forth their knowledge, their voices, through ritual. The process might include circles drawn with salt or chalk, Latin invocations mixed with biblical verses, and the burning of rare substances, sulfur, laurel, or pitch. Sometimes it was performed in graveyards, sometimes in sealed chambers with relics or bones placed at the center. It was always dangerous, and always secret. One of the most notorious examples was King Charles VI of France, whose reign in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was marked by instability and madness. In his darker periods, when he believed himself made of glass or forgot his own name, it's said that his court turned to astrologers and occultists, hoping to understand what afflicted him. Whispers told of seances and spirit rituals conducted in locked rooms, quiet pleadings, not just for healing, but for explanation. Even more curiously, Emperor Frederick II, brilliant and unorthodox, was rumored to have dabbled in necromantic practices, drawing on Arabic texts and the writings of ancient philosophers. Though his intellectual court prized science, he also kept close those who understood the old shadowed arts. In these moments, necromancy was not superstition. It was a last resort, a plea to the unseen when earthly wisdom failed. The church condemned such practices outright. Necromancy was associated with demons, heresy, and spiritual corruption. Those caught performing it could be excommunicated or worse. Yet even high-ranking clergy sometimes blurred the lines. There were bishops and abbots educated in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew who studied the ars notoria, the notable art, a form of ceremonial magic believed to summon divine knowledge through visions, not spirits. For monarchs, these gray areas became opportunities. A ritual might be cloaked in scripture, but its goal was still the same, to hear what should not be heard. Sometimes the dead were invoked by dream. A king might sleep beside a relic or on the tomb of a saint, hoping for a vision or visitation. These incubation rites were rooted in older traditions, echoes of ancient paganism reshaped into Christian yearning. A monarch might claim to have spoken with a dead predecessor, or seen a mother or child lost to plague, and whether or not the vision was real, the impact was entire policies changed because of what came in a dream. History does not preserve all the names. Many of these rituals were kept secret, written in ciphered letters, buried in chronicles only deciphered centuries later. But they leave their shadows, sudden reversals in royal decisions, nighttime journeys to remote chapels, court physicians dismissed after mysterious failures. In those traces we glimpse something that even crowns could not escape, the human need to understand loss, to speak once more with the dead, to ask in whispered words, "What should I do next?" And so, in candlelit rooms and stone chapels lost to time, monarchs once reached beyond the grave, not for power, but for clarity, for comfort, for a sign. And in that silence, whether real or imagined, they sometimes found what they were looking for. In the great halls of medieval courts, spectacle was not just entertainment, it was a language. Every gesture, every costume, every person on display conveyed meaning. And among the strangest figures in this ritual theater were those whom the court considered wonders, individuals with dwarfism, visible differences, or eccentric minds whose very presence became symbolic. They were jesters, fools, curiosities, and sometimes unwitting mirrors to royal power. Their lives were not private. They were lived as performance, strange, intimate, and often deeply misunderstood. Nearly every major European court employed at least one court fool, but not all fools were clowns. Some were intellectuals disguised as jesters. Others lived with cognitive or emotional differences. A few were children, and many were individuals with physical traits considered unusual, short stature, limb differences, or congenital conditions that set them apart. They were dressed in elaborate clothing, given strange titles, and kept in close proximity to kings and queens, not just to amuse, but to symbolize inversion. The fool, in many ways, was the only one allowed to speak truth under the veil of humor. Monarchs sometimes kept dwarfs as signs of wealth and rarity, much like exotic animals or relics. Isabella of Spain kept several. Catherine de' Medici famously traveled with a retinue that included performers of all kinds, selected to entertain and bewilder foreign courts. In Russia, Peter the Great hosted a mock wedding for a court dwarf, complete with costumes, feast, and music, an event that was equal parts theater and cruelty. These were people placed into roles for the sake of display, their bodies woven into the tapestry of royal spectacle. Yet the relationships were not always mocking or cold. Some monarchs developed deep, lasting bonds with their jesters or wonders. King Lear's fool, while fictional, reflects something real. The idea that only the fool could comfort the king, could question him without punishment, could walk the border between ridicule and intimacy. There are stories of queens who wept at the deaths of their dwarves, kings who granted them estates or pensions. For some, these roles offered protection, a strange kind of privilege within the cage of court. Still, it was a life of contradiction. To be seen always, but not truly known. To be celebrated, but never equal. To be turned into symbol. A living metaphor for fortune's turns, for mortality, for the limits of order. At coronations and feasts, they might dance in front of lords and bishops. At night, they might eat alone, watched over by guards or stewards. They belonged to no class. They were both inside and outside the world of power. Occasionally, these figures recorded their own voices. One jester, Archibald Armstrong, served under multiple English monarchs and published a satirical book after his dismissal. His words reveal a mind fully aware of the tightrope he walked. Clever, resentful, sharp, others left no record. Their stories come to us only through the eyes of those who watched, laughed, or condemned. And so, behind the glitter of court performance, beneath the silk and noise, lived a small world of strange companions to power. People whose lives were shaped not by birthright or ambition, but by the gaze of the throne. Their presence reminded monarchs of folly, of fragility, of fate. In their laughter was something deeper than humor, something harder, and something perhaps that the crown could never quite command. The medieval mind did not always grant peace to the dead. Even a royal corpse draped in velvet, sealed in gold, sung over by choirs, could become a stage for fear, punishment, or political theater. Some kings were laid out for weeks, their bodies slowly decaying in candlelit halls, watched by mourners and rivals alike. Others were exhumed, examined, even put on trial, long after their final breath. Death was not always an escape. Sometimes it was just another performance. To display a monarch's body after death was a common ritual. It allowed subjects to pay respects and gave visual proof that the king had indeed passed. But these displays were often unsettling. In the absence of preservation techniques, the body would begin to rot, even under silks and incense. Eyewitnesses described the smell, the swelling, the blackening of skin. Yet the court insisted on open viewings, sometimes for days on end, as if to remind the kingdom, here is your sovereign, now dust and shadow, power decays too. Some of the most extreme ceremonies followed unexpected or controversial deaths. When King Edward I of England died in 1307, his embalmed body was displayed for over 2 weeks. Later, his bones were re-examined in the 18th century and found unusually well preserved, but others were not so lucky. King John, hated by many, was buried quickly in Worcester Cathedral. Legends swirled that his body was already bloated and discolored by poison. Whether true or not, the rumors lingered like a second death. And then there were the posthumous trials, moments when death offered no protection. The most infamous was the Cadaver Synod of 897, in which Pope Formosus, already dead and buried, was exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and placed on trial in Rome by his successor, Pope Stephen VI. The corpse, rotting and silent, was accused of crimes against the church. A deacon was appointed to speak on his behalf. When found guilty, the body was stripped of its garments, mutilated, and cast into the Tiber. It was a grotesque spectacle, fueled by political hatred, but it set a chilling precedent that not even death could shield a ruler from vengeance. In some cases, royal bodies were exhumed, not to punish, but to prove sainthood or corruption. The church occasionally reopened tombs to examine a monarch's remains for signs of divine preservation. Incorruptibility. If the body was found unspoiled, it was seen as a sign of sanctity. If bones were scattered or flesh unnaturally degraded, it could be taken as divine judgment. The grave, in these moments, became a courtroom, and the body, silent, still bore witness. Sometimes the dead were moved, not tried, transferred from one tomb to another to assert a new claim, to anchor a dynasty, or to erase a past. A successor might relocate a predecessor's remains to a grander resting place, or conversely, to somewhere obscure. The act was never merely logistical. It was always political. The wear of a royal corpse mattered, near saints, near ancestors, near power. Even in death, placement was destiny. And so, in these chilling rituals, viewings, trials, exhumations, the medieval world revealed its strange truth, that kings did not cease to be kings when they died. Their bodies, even in ruin, still shaped the realm, still spoke, still terrified. In the silence of death, they could be loved more fiercely or hated more freely, but never ignored. Of all the symbols of monarchy, none held more weight or more mystery than the crown itself. It was not merely an object of gold and gemstones. It was the visible soul of the state. And yet, throughout medieval history, crowns did not always rest neatly atop royal heads or behind glass in quiet chapels. They were hidden, buried, stolen, remade, and sometimes deliberately destroyed. The crown could outlive the king or vanish with him. And when it did, something strange always followed. In times of war or upheaval, Crowns were often buried, literally wrapped in cloth, sealed in chests, sunk beneath castle floors or monastery walls. During the English Civil Wars centuries later, royalists hid regalia to keep them from Cromwell's forces, but the tradition began much earlier. In the 13th and 14th centuries, kings preparing for flight would entrust their crowns to loyal monks or knights, hiding them not just from enemies, but from fate itself. To lose the crown was to risk losing the right to rule. Some crowns were simply lost to time. The Iron Crown of Lombardy, used to crown kings of Italy, contains a mysterious band said to be forged from a nail of the true cross. Its origins are ancient, perhaps mythic. It vanished for a time in the Middle Ages, only to resurface centuries later. The crown of Arthur, if it ever existed, was said to be buried at Glastonbury, or Tintagel, part relic, part legend. In these stories, the line between treasure and symbol blurs. What mattered was not the metal, but what people believed it had once meant. Others were destroyed on purpose. When monarchies fell, crowns were sometimes melted down, reduced to coins, ingots, raw gold, not for greed, but for erasure. After the execution of Charles I of England, Parliament ordered the royal regalia dismantled, its gems sold, its gold repurposed. A new world demanded new symbols. Yet even then, stories survived that one or two pieces were hidden, smuggled away, waiting for a restoration. The crown, in this sense, never fully died. It waited. In some cultures, crowns were renewed with each monarch destroyed and recast to symbolize a fresh beginning. In others, like the Holy Roman Empire, a single crown was passed down for centuries, unchanged, touched by the hands of dozens of kings. That crown, delicately inlaid with enamel and adorned with biblical scenes, was considered so sacred it could only be handled by clergy. The monarch was crowned not by power, but by permission. There were also false crowns, forgeries made to deceive or comfort. Pretenders to the throne sometimes commissioned replicas to bolster their claim. In other cases, lost crowns were imagined into being by chroniclers and painters, recreated from rumor and hope. These phantom crowns, though never real, shaped memory as deeply as metal. They lived in legend and in dreams. And so, the crown object of reverence, fear, and longing comes to rest here at the end of our journey. Not on a head, but in a story, perhaps buried beneath a crumbled chapel, perhaps resting in a darkened vault, or perhaps melted into nothing. Its gold now part of a chalice or coin, scattered and reformed. But wherever it lies, the crown remains a question as much as a symbol. What does it mean to rule? What is passed on, and what is lost? And in the quiet spaces of history, who still waits for its return?